The scent of aging paper and red ink filled the quiet of the Chandler pages. My pen scratched across the ledger, each number a confirmation of what I already knew we were sinking. The bell above the door didn't just chime, it shattered the silence. My sister Olivia blew in like a gust of wind, all vibrant scarf and self-importance. "Claire, I need the gallery deposit for my exhibition," she announced, not asked. "Just pull it from the store's account." My pen stopped bleeding a small dark circle onto the page. An exhibition. "Of course. My name is Claire, and I'm 32 years old. For the last 5 years I've been the keeper of my father's legacy, a bookstore that was once the heart of our small New England town. Now it was a ghost, haunted by dwindling sales and the rising cost of everything. My dream hadn't been this. It had been a corner office in a Manhattan high-rise, a junior editor position at a major publishing house that I'd been offered right after graduation. I could still feel the weight of that acceptance letter in my hand, the crisp paper, a ticket to a life I had built for myself. But then Dad got sick. 6 months, the doctors said. 6 months that turned into a blur of hospital visits and hushed conversations. On one of those last clear days, he held my hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "The store, Claire," he'd whispered. "Don't let it die with me. Take care of them." Them. My mother, Susan, and Olivia. He didn't have to say it. I was the responsible one. I always had been. So I let the dream of New York fade a ghost of a life I'd never live. I stayed. I took over the ledgers, learned the suppliers, and poured every ounce of myself into keeping the Chandler pages alive. I kept my promise. "Did you hear me?" Olivia's voice snapped me back to the present. "The deposit is due Friday. It's only $5,000. Only." The word hung in the air, thick with a privilege I had never known. Before I could answer, my mother swept in from the back room, a feather duster in hand, her expression one of practiced concern. "Claire, don't be difficult," Susan said, her voice soft but laced with steel. "We talked about this. Olivia's exhibition is a wonderful marketing opportunity for the store." I stared at her. "Marketing, Mom. Our sales were down 15% last quarter. We have a final notice from our biggest supplier. We can't afford a $5,000 marketing opportunity." "It's an investment," Olivia chimed in, perfectly echoing my mother. "I'll be featured in the local Arts Gazette. People will see my work. They'll see the bookstore's name as a sponsor. It brings in a whole new, more sophisticated crowd. A crowd that would buy what exactly? The $300 coffee table books we couldn't afford to stock." "Your father would have wanted you to support your sister's art," Mom said, and there it was, the trump card. The one she played whenever she needed to win an argument I was too tired to fight. She moved to stand beside Olivia, a united front of artistic ambition and financial cluelessness. He was so proud of her talent. He was proud of my head for numbers, too. He was the one who taught me how to balance a ledger, how to negotiate with suppliers. He'd seen my mind as a tool, something practical and useful. He'd seen Olivia's art as something beautiful, something to be admired. The difference had never felt so stark. "We don't have the money," I said again, my voice quiet but firm. "The account for new inventory has just enough to cover the order we desperately need for the fall season. If I give you that money, we won't have new books on the shelves until Christmas." "Then just order fewer books," Olivia said with a shrug, as if the solution were that simple. "Honestly, Claire, sometimes you're so rigid. It's like you don't want the store to evolve." "Evolve into what? An art gallery that didn't sell art. A bookstore that didn't sell books." "We're not discussing this further," my mother said, her tone final. Olivia needs this for her career. The store needs the exposure. You're the one who handles the accounts, so handle it. Make it work." She turned her back on me, a clear dismissal, and started fussing over one of Olivia's paintings that was propped against a bookshelf. "We should hang this right at the front, darling. Let people see what real talent looks like." I stood there in the quiet of my father's dying dream, trapped between his last wish and their casual demands. Make it work. The words echoed in the silence, a command, not a request. For 5 years I had made it work. I had patched the leaking roof of this business with my own savings. I had filled the gaps in the shelves with my own time. I had balanced the books, paid the bills, and sacrificed my own life, all while they saw nothing but the one who wasn't there. That night I sat at the old wooden desk in the back office, the same desk my father had used for 30 years. The faint scent of his pipe tobacco still clung to the wood. I pulled up the bookstore's bank account. The balance was painfully low, just over $6,000. $5,000 for Olivia's gallery deposit, $1,000 left to keep the lights on and pay our one part-time employee until the end of the month. No new books, not a single one. The fall season was our busiest time of year. Tourists, students returning to the local college. They came looking for new releases for the comfort of a fresh story. We would have nothing to offer them but dusty shelves and old inventory. It was a death sentence for the store. I knew it, and a part of me, a small, dark part, knew they knew it too. They just didn't care. The cursor blinked on the screen, a tiny rhythmic heartbeat in the quiet room. All I had to do was say no. Just one word. A word I had practiced in the mirror 100 times, but had never managed to say out loud when it mattered. No. The bookstore comes first. No. We can't afford it. No. It's not my responsibility to fund your vanity project. The words were there lined up in my head, but they couldn't seem to make the journey to my mouth. I thought of my father's face in those final weeks, the fear in his eyes. "The store is our story, Claire," he'd said. "It's all I have to leave you." He had left me a legacy, but it felt more like a sentence. A life sentence of obligation. I minimized the bank window and stared at my desktop background, a photo I'd taken years ago. A skyline. New York City. The dream I had packed away in a box and stored in the attic of my mind. With a sigh that felt like it came from the deepest part of my soul, I opened the banking portal again. My fingers moved automatically, typing in the account number for the art gallery, entering the amount. $5,000. I paused before hitting confirm. One click, and the future of the Chandler pages would be sealed. One click, and I would once again choose their wants over our needs. And people watching from the outside, they'd ask the question I asked myself 1,000 times. Why didn't you just say no? Why did you let them walk all over you? It's a fair question, one that makes sense if you think life is a series of clear choices. But they don't understand the prison without bars. They don't understand the invisible chains forged from a lifetime of being told your needs come second. When you spend your entire life as the responsible one, your sense of self gets tangled up with your usefulness to others. You learn that love is conditional earned through sacrifice. Saying no doesn't just feel selfish. It feels like you're risking your entire identity. It feels like you might disappear if you stop holding everyone else up. It's a phenomenon psychologists call learned helplessness. After years of fighting battles, you know you'll lose after years of your voice being drowned out. You learn that compliance isn't weakness. It's a survival strategy. It's the quiet, soul-crushing art of keeping the peace by sacrificing pieces of yourself one by one until you're not sure what's left. It was easier to hit confirm and face the slow death of the bookstore than to face the storm that would erupt if I refused. It was easier to be the good daughter, the reliable sister, than to be the one who finally stood up and said, "What about me?" So I clicked. The screen flashed, transaction successful. $5,000 gone, the future of the store gone, my last shred of hope gone with it. My phone buzzed almost immediately. It was a text from Olivia. "Got it, you're the best. Now, I can finally book the caterer." Do you think mini quiches are too cliché? I stared at the message, at the casual, unthinking entitlement of it all. No thank you, no acknowledgement of the sacrifice. Just on to the next detail of her perfect, curated life funded by the ruins of mine. I set the phone face down. The weight of the legacy was crushing, and for the first time, I felt the terrifying certainty that it was going to bury me. Olivia's exhibition was held in a rented gallery space downtown, a place with stark white walls and aggressively modern track lighting. The kind of place that tries too hard to be sophisticated and ends up feeling sterile. Her paintings were large, abstract canvases filled with chaotic splashes of color and given pretentious titles like Urban Decay in Mauve and Internal Dialogue of a Forgotten Teacup. My mother, Susan, floated through the sparse crowd, dressed in a silk blouse she'd bought for the occasion, pointing out the subtle genius in Olivia's brushstrokes. I stood by the wine table, pouring cheap Chardonnay into plastic cups, my sponsorship duties reduced to being an unpaid bartender. The crowd consisted mostly of my mother's friends, and a few of Olivia's, all of them murmuring vague compliments, while their eyes darted toward the exit. No one was buying anything. I watched as person after person would pick up a price list, see the 4-figure numbers Olivia had assigned to her work, and then gently place it back down with a tight, polite smile. "It's just not the right crowd," Olivia whispered to me an hour into the event her own smile strained. "They don't have an eye for avant-garde work." I just nodded, swirling the cheap wine in my cup, the money from the inventory account gone. The future of the store hanging on the wall in garish unsold splotches of paint. By the end of the night, the only things that had been consumed were the wine and a platter of sad-looking cheese cubes. Not a single painting had sold, not even the small $500 one she'd priced to move. As we packed up the unsold canvases, the silence in the gallery was heavier than any of the artwork. Olivia was quiet, her earlier confidence replaced by a sullen pout. My mother was the one who finally spoke. "Well, the exposure was what mattered," she said, her voice a little too bright. "People saw the name, the Chandler pages. It plants a seed. It had planted a seed, all right. A seed of financial ruin that was about to sprout." The next 2 weeks were a slow-motion nightmare. The final demand from our largest book supplier arrived on a Tuesday, printed on angry red paper. Payment overdue 30 days. Final notice. The amount was $4,700. Money we didn't have. Money that was now a collection of unsold paintings stacked in my old bedroom. I placed the notice on the kitchen table, where Mom and Olivia were having coffee. "They're going to cut us off," I said, my voice flat. "If we don't pay this by Friday, they won't ship our fall order." My mother picked up the notice, her brow furrowed. "Well, what are we supposed to do? You're the one who handles the finances, Claire. Be creative." Creative. The word came out sharper than I intended. There's no creative way to make $4,000 appear out of thin air. Mom, the money is gone. We spent it on the exhibition. "Don't blame my exhibition," Olivia snapped from across the table. "It's not my fault this town is full of Philistines. My art is a long-term investment." "The bookstore doesn't have time for a long-term investment," I wanted to scream. It needed a short-term miracle. "You'll just have to call them," my mother said, dismissing the problem with a wave of her hand. "Explain the situation. Ask for an extension." I had already asked for an extension last month. They had been clear. This was the final deadline. That Friday, I sat at my father's desk, the red notice in front of me, the phone, feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. I had spent the last 3 days calling in favors, trying to get a small business loan, even considering putting the store's expenses on my personal credit card, which was already nearly maxed out. Nothing worked. At 4:45, just before the supplier's office closed for the weekend, the phone rang. It was Mr. Davies, our account manager for over 20 years. "Claire," he said, and his voice was not unkind, but it was firm. "I haven't received the payment. I'm afraid I have to suspend your account." "Mr. Davies, please," I begged the professional calm. "I usually maintained crumbling. Just a little more time. We've had a difficult quarter." "I'm sorry, Claire. I fought for you, but my hands are tied. The suspension is indefinite. No new orders until the balance is paid in full." The click on the other end of the line was the sound of the last nail being hammered into my father's coffin. I sat there in the deepening twilight of the bookstore, the phone still pressed to my ear, listening to the dial tone. No new books for fall. No new books for Christmas. The Chandler Pages was officially a dead bookstore walking. The weight of it all, the 5 years of sacrifice, the empty promises, the crushing responsibility finally broke me. I lowered my head to the desk, surrounded by the ghosts of stories we would never sell, and for the first time since my father died, I wept. The weekend passed in a thick, gray fog of despair. I opened the bookstore out of habit, but there were no new arrivals to unpack, no orders to fill. I just moved dust around with a rag, the silence of the shelves mocking me. Customers would wander in, browse for a moment, and leave with a sympathetic look when they realized there was nothing new to see. Each time the bell chimed, my stomach twisted. On Saturday afternoon, I was in the back office, staring at the stack of unpaid bills when the bell rang again. I didn't move. I couldn't face another pitying glance. But then I heard a man's voice, calm and unfamiliar. "Excuse me, is Claire Chandler here?" I pushed myself up from the desk and walked into the main room. A man stood near the entrance, tall and distinguished, wearing a tailored suit that seemed out of place among the dusty, neglected shelves. He was in his late 60s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "I'm Claire," I said. He offered a small smile and extended his hand. "Arthur Vance. I was a friend of your father's. His lawyer, actually. My father's lawyer." I shook his hand, my own feeling small and cold in his firm grip. We hadn't spoken to an attorney since the will was read 5 years ago. "It's nice to meet you," I said. "Is everything okay?" "That's what I came to ask you," he said, his gaze sweeping over the empty displays. "I've been keeping an eye on the store from a distance. Your father, he made me promise I would." He saw the notice from the supplier, still sitting on the counter, its red ink, practically screaming. "I see I'm not too late then." "Too late for what?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "To watch the store die, I think you're about a day late for that." "No," he said gently. "I'm here to stop it." He opened the leather briefcase he was carrying and pulled out a thick document bound in blue. "This is a copy of your father's will. I'm sure you remember the main points. The store, the house, all left to your mother with you, as the manager of the business." I nodded, a bitter taste in my mouth. "But your father was a pragmatist," Arthur continued. "He knew your mother's tendencies. He knew Olivia's ambitions. And he knew you. He knew the weight he was placing on your shoulders." He flipped to a page near the back of the document, sectioned off and marked Appendix C. He included a final provision, a fail-safe, one that I, as the executor, was only to reveal under specific circumstances. He slid the document across the counter toward me. My eyes scanned the dense legal text, but my brain couldn't seem to process the words. What is this? Your father called it the Chandler Collection, Arthur explained. Over his lifetime, he collected books. Not just any books. First editions, signed copies. He kept them in a climate-controlled safe deposit box at the downtown bank. There's a Faulkner signed to his own mother. A first edition Hemingway with the original dust jacket. A Steinbeck. He spent 10 years tracking down. I stared at him, my mind reeling. I remembered Dad's love for old books, the way he'd handle them with reverence, but I never knew he was a serious collector. The collection is valued at, well, the last appraisal was 3 years ago, and it was just over $150,000, Arthur said quietly. I imagine it's worth more now. $150,000. The number was so large it felt unreal. Enough to pay off the suppliers, enough to stock the shelves for a year, enough to save everything. The will is very specific, Arthur went on, tapping the page. The collection is not part of the general estate. It was to be held in trust, its existence known only to you and me. It could only be accessed, and I quote, in the event of extreme financial distress that threatens the continued existence of the Chandler pages. He wanted to give you a tool, Claire, a last resort to be used only when all other options were exhausted. He looked at me, his expression full of a kindness I hadn't felt from anyone in years. From what I can see, we've reached that point. I sank onto the stool behind the counter, my legs suddenly unable to support me. The will, the collection. It wasn't just about the money. It was a message. A final act of trust from the one person who had always seen me, who had understood the burden he was leaving me with. He hadn't left me defenseless, after all. He had left me a key. What do I do? I whispered. The trust is in your name, Arthur said. You have sole authority to liquidate the assets for the express purpose of saving this bookstore. I've already prepared the necessary paperwork to access the vault. All you have to do is sign. He slid a pen across the counter. I picked it up, my fingers closing around it. The bookstore wasn't dead. It was on life support, and my father had just handed me the switch to turn the machine back on. The power, the choice. For the first time in 5 years, it was mine. A new kind of energy surged through me, pushing away the despair, replacing it with a cold, hard resolve. I wasn't just the keeper of his legacy anymore. I was its last line of defense. And I wasn't going to let it fall. The bank vault was cold, colder than the autumn air outside, a sterile metallic cold that seemed to suck the warmth right out of my skin. Arthur Vance stood beside me, his presence, a quiet reassurance as the bank manager inserted a key into the lock of a long, narrow metal box. And yours, Mr. Vance, the manager said, stepping back. Arthur slid his own key into the second lock. There was a solid, satisfying clank as the mechanism released. He pulled the box from the wall, the metal scraping softly, and carried it to a small, private viewing room. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, my heart wasn't pounding with dread, but with a frantic, hopeful excitement. This was it. The life raft my father had left for me. Arthur placed the box on the table and lifted the heavy lid. I leaned forward, holding my breath. It wasn't a jumble of old books. It was a perfectly organized treasure chest. Each volume was wrapped in acid-free paper, labeled in my father's neat architectural handwriting. I could almost feel his presence in that room, the ghost of his love for these physical objects, for the stories they held. My fingers trembled as I reached for the first one. I unwrapped it carefully, the faded blue dust jacket of a first edition Hemingway. It felt electric in my hands. Next was a Faulkner, its spine still crisp. I was touching history. I was touching the one part of my father he had kept entirely for himself, a secret passion hidden from the world. He loved these, I whispered more to myself than to Arthur. More than anything, Arthur confirmed, his voice soft. He said they were proof that something beautiful could last. He handed me a sheet of paper from his briefcase. This was his inventory. The last one he updated just before he got sick. I scanned the list, my eyes catching on the names of authors I knew he revered. Woolf, Fitzgerald. And then at the very bottom, his prized possession, the cornerstone of the whole collection. One by one we unwrapped them, checking them against the list. It was a ritual, a sacred act of rediscovery. Each book was a small victory, a confirmation that help was here. But as we neared the bottom of the box, a knot of unease began to twist in my stomach. There were fewer books left than there were names on the list. Wait, I said, my voice tight. I picked up the inventory sheet again. We had checked off almost everything. But the last one, the most important one? My eyes darted around the now mostly empty box. Where is it? I asked, a frantic edge creeping into my voice. The Steinbeck. Where's the Steinbeck? Arthur's smile faded. It should be at the very bottom. It was the heaviest. He always put it there. He reached into the box himself, his hands searching the corners. He came up empty. We took the remaining books out, placing them carefully on the table until the metal box was completely bare. There was nothing. Just the cold, unforgiving gleam of stainless steel. The book was gone. A first edition signed copy of The Grapes of Wrath, the single most valuable book in the entire collection. The one Arthur had mentioned was worth nearly a third of the total appraisal. The hope that had filled my chest just minutes before didn't just fade. It collapsed, leaving a hollow, ragged hole. That's not possible, Arthur was saying, his voice, a low murmur of disbelief. The trust documents, no one has access but you, Claire. The keys have been in my firm's vault since your father passed. You're the only one with the authority to open this. The sterile air of the viewing room suddenly felt thick, suffocating. He was right. According to the will, according to the law, I was the only one, but I had never been here before. I didn't even know this collection existed until Saturday. My mind raced, scrambling for an explanation. A bank error, a theft. But the vault was secure, the box untampered with. The truth settled over me, not with a crash, but with a sickening, cold clarity. Arthur didn't know the whole story. He didn't know about the $5,000 for the art show. He didn't know about the final notice from the supplier. He didn't know the depths of the desperation I had been living in. But two other people did. Two people who had watched me sacrifice everything for the store. Two people who knew I was at my breaking point. Two people who had benefited from every sacrifice I had ever made. My mother and my sister. The drive back from the bank was a blur. The streets of Concord, usually so charming with their colonial architecture and autumn foliage, just looked gray and hostile. Arthur's words kept replaying in my head. No one has access but you, Claire. Legally, that was the truth. But my family had never operated according to the law. They operated according to a different, unwritten code. What Olivia wants, Olivia gets. And what Claire has is ours for the taking. I pulled into the driveway behind Olivia's ridiculously oversized SUV. Through the living room window, I could see her and my mother sitting on the couch, laughing at something on a laptop. The picture of domestic bliss, completely oblivious to the fact that our world was collapsing. Or maybe not oblivious. Maybe they were the ones who had lit the match. I walked inside, letting the front door slam behind me with more force than necessary. They both looked up, their smiles faltering. "Claire, you're home early. my mother said, closing the laptop. Is everything all right? You look pale. Where is it? I asked, my voice coming out colder than I expected. I didn't bother taking off my coat. I just stood in the entryway, a sentinel at the gate of my own betrayal. Olivia raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. Where is what, honestly, Claire, your cryptic entrances are getting so dramatic? The Steinbeck, I said, letting the name hang in the air between us. The first edition, Dad's signed copy of The Grapes of Wrath. Where is it? My mother's face went blank. A practiced, careful blankness I knew all too well. I have no idea what you're talking about, dear. A book? Don't, I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous level. Don't pretend you don't know. I was at the bank with Arthur Vance. I've seen the collection. That was the moment the facade cracked. I saw it in the flicker of panic in Olivia's eyes and the way my mother's hand went to her throat. They hadn't expected me to find out. They had counted on my ignorance, on my quiet, long-suffering compliance. Arthur shouldn't have. My mother began, her voice weak. He did what Dad asked him to do. I cut her off. He gave me the key when the store was about to die. But the most valuable piece, the one meant to be the ultimate safety net, is gone. So I'm going to ask you again, where is it? Olivia stood up, crossing her arms defensively. It's not a big deal. Not a big deal. The words were a physical blow. It was worth $50,000, Olivia. It was our last hope. I needed it, she said, her voice rising. I had an opportunity, a once-in-a-lifetime trip to Santa Fe for an artist's retreat. It was crucial for my creative development. We didn't have the money, and that book was just sitting there collecting dust. We didn't have the money because you spent it on a failed art show, I shot back, the anger finally breaking through the ice. You drained the store's accounts for your vanity, and when that wasn't enough, you stole from our dead father. I didn't steal it, she said, her face a mask of indignation. I borrowed against its value. I was going to pay it back once my art career took off. And you? I said, turning to my mother. You let her do it. You knew. You stood by and watched her sell off a piece of Dad's soul so she could go on a vacation. It wasn't a vacation, Susan whispered, tears welling in her eyes. It was for her future. We sold it 6 months ago. We thought the store would recover. We never thought you'd have to know. 6 months. They had sold it 6 months ago, while I was losing sleep over unpaid bills, while I was working extra hours to cover our shortfalls, while I was eating ramen noodles for dinner so we could afford to keep the lights on. They had sold a $50,000 asset and kept it a secret, watching me struggle, knowing they had already spent our only lifeline on a trip to find inspiration. The betrayal was absolute. It wasn't just about the money. It was the deliberate, calculated deception. They had watched me carry the weight of the world on my shoulders, all while knowing they had secretly lightened their own load by stealing from the foundation I was trying to protect. I looked at them, my mother crying, her performative tears, my sister defiant in her selfishness, and I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, just a vast, cold emptiness. The final thread connecting me to them, the one woven from shared history and a misguided sense of duty, had just snapped. They weren't my family anymore. They were just strangers who had robbed me. Strangers I happened to live with. The week after the Steinbeck revelation was a masterclass in silent warfare. The house, which had always felt small, now felt suffocating, thick with unspoken accusations. My mother would leave pamphlets for grief counseling on my pillow. Olivia would sigh dramatically whenever I entered a room, as if my very presence was a burden on her artistic soul. They didn't apologize. They didn't explain. They simply treated me like a problem that had unfortunately become self-aware. They spoke to each other in hushed tones when they thought I couldn't hear conversations that would stop abruptly the moment I walked in. They were closing ranks, forming a united front of delusion against the inconvenient truth I had uncovered. They were a family, and I was just an auditor who had overstayed her welcome. Then on a Tuesday morning, my friend Sarah, who owned the little antique shop down the street, sent me a text, a screenshot of a social media post. You're not going to believe this. Olivia is doing a live interview tonight with the Literary Lioness. The Literary Lioness was a prominent book blogger, a woman with a massive online following and a reputation for her sharp, insightful interviews. Of course she was. This was Olivia's playbook. When caught in a lie, don't admit fault. Just find a bigger stage and tell a more convincing story. Control the narrative. I spent the day watching her prepare. She transformed my father's old study, which had become her painting studio, into a makeshift set. She arranged books on the shelves behind her chair, not our dusty, unsold inventory, but pristine, intellectual-looking hardcovers she must have bought for the occasion. She spent an hour adjusting the lighting, trying to find the angle that made her look the most thoughtful, the most wounded. I watched her practice in the mirror, her face a mask of curated sorrow. My sister, bless her heart, she sees the world in numbers and profit and loss. She rehearsed her voice, a soft, tragic murmur. I see it in color, in emotion. It's been a source of creative tension between us. My mother circled her like a director, adjusting Olivia's scarf, telling her to look more vulnerable when she talked about our father. Mention how he always encouraged your artistic spirit, Susan coached. Make them understand that you're just trying to honor his legacy in your own way. Their legacy. They were weaponizing my father's memory against me, twisting his love for the bookstore into a justification for their theft. I retreated to the quiet of the store downstairs. While they were building a new fiction upstairs, I was surrounded by the stark reality of their actions. The empty spaces on the shelves where new books should be. The silence where the chime of the bell should be ringing for happy customers. That evening I sat in the back office, my laptop open, the live feed of the interview flickering on the screen. I didn't want to watch, but I had to. I had to see the story they were going to sell to the world. Olivia appeared on screen, framed by the soft, flattering light she had spent all afternoon perfecting. She looked like a poet from a bygone era, all delicate features and soulful eyes. The lioness, a woman named Margaret, started with easy questions. She asked about Olivia's artistic journey, about her deep connection to the historic bookstore her father had left behind. Olivia was brilliant. I had to give her that. She spun a tale of a sensitive artist, a young woman trying to bring a modern vision to a beloved but struggling institution. She spoke of countless hours spent among the stacks as a child, finding inspiration in the pages of classic literature. I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen her pick up a book she wasn't using as a coaster. It's been a challenge, Olivia said, a perfect glistening tear tracing a path down her cheek. My sister Claire is incredibly practical. She keeps the business running. But sometimes in the pursuit of financial stability, we can lose sight of the art, of the soul, of a place like this. My exhibition was an attempt to bring that soul back, to remind the community that this is more than just a store. It's a cultural hub. She was painting me as the villain, the cold, calculating numbers person who was stifling her beautiful artistic spirit, and people in the comments were eating it up. So brave, one wrote. It's so hard when family doesn't understand your passion, another typed. I felt a cold, hard knot form in my stomach. This was it. This was how they would win. They would rewrite history in real time, and I would be cast as the unfeeling antagonist in the tragic story of Olivia Chandler. The interview was almost over. Margaret was wrapping up, thanking Olivia for her time, for her raw honesty. Olivia was smiling her sad, brave smile. She had done it. She had won. But then the lioness's smile tightened just a fraction. Olivia, before we go, I have to ask. There are some rumors circulating, started by the bookstore's suppliers, I believe. They talk about a valuable family asset. A rare book. Perhaps. The air went out of the room. I leaned closer to the screen. This wasn't part of their script. Olivia's smile didn't waver, but I saw the flicker of something in her eyes. The same panic I'd seen when I confronted her about the Steinbeck, but she recovered quickly. She tilted her head, her expression shifting to one of profound sadness. That she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, is a very painful subject. It was a difficult family decision. She was prepared. She had a story for this, too. And I knew with a sickening certainty that whatever she said next would be the most devastating lie of all. Margaret the lioness leaned forward slightly, her expression shifting from friendly interviewer to something sharper, more focused. A difficult decision, she repeated, her voice smooth as silk. Could you elaborate on that? For our viewers who might not know the full story, Olivia took a deep, shaky breath, a masterful performance of a woman grappling with a painful memory. Of course, she whispered. The bookstore. My father's legacy has been struggling. My mother and I were faced with an impossible choice. We could let it go under, or we could part with something incredibly precious to us, a family heirloom to keep the doors open. She looked directly into the camera, her eyes shining with unshed tears. So yes, we sold a book from my father's collection. We sold it to pay our suppliers to ensure this wonderful place could continue to serve the community. It broke our hearts, but it was a sacrifice we were willing to make. The comments section flooded with sympathy. What a selfless daughter. That's what family is all about. So much integrity. I watched my stomach churning with the audacity of her lie. She was painting herself as the store's savior, using a crisis she had helped create. Margaret was silent for a long moment, letting Olivia's words hang in the air. That's a very moving story, Olivia, she said finally. But the timeline is a little confusing to me. Olivia's smile tightened by a millimeter. How so? Well, Margaret said, her tone still conversational. My understanding is that the final notices from your primary supplier weren't sent until late September, but sources indicate the book was sold in early March, a full 6 months prior. The air in the back office felt thin. I stopped breathing. This was it. Olivia blinked. A small, almost imperceptible hesitation. There were other bills. We were trying to get ahead of the problem, she stammered, but the confidence was gone. I see, Margaret said, her voice still pleasant. 'Cause it's interesting. I was looking through your social media in preparation for this interview. You have a wonderful eye for photography, by the way. You took an artist's retreat to Santa Fe in March, didn't you? It looked absolutely beautiful and quite expensive. The trap had been sprung. It was so elegant, so simple, so devastating. Olivia's face flushed a deep, ugly red. The mask of the soulful artist didn't just slip, it shattered. What are you implying? She snapped, her voice suddenly high and shrill, all traces of the gentle artist gone. I'm not implying anything, Margaret said calmly. I'm just a book lover who also loves numbers. And the numbers here are telling a story. You're saying you sold a $50,000 asset to pay bills that weren't even due yet, and it just coincidentally funded an expensive personal trip for you. And that's when it happened. The implosion. Cornered, exposed, and stripped of her carefully crafted narrative, Olivia abandoned all pretense of grace. That retreat was not a personal trip, she spat into the camera. It was a vital investment in my creative development. That money wasn't just sitting there, it was an asset that I was entitled to use to further my career, a career that is the only thing bringing any cultural relevance to that dusty old store. My father would have wanted me to have it. That money was an investment in my talent, and I had a right to it. She was breathing heavily, her eyes wild. The chat on the side of the screen had gone from a river of text to a frozen wall of shocked emojis. Margaret stared at Olivia, her professional poise momentarily broken by genuine shock. She recovered quickly. "Well," she said, her voice now cool and clipped. "Thank you for your honesty, Olivia. That was certainly illuminating. I think that's all the time we have for tonight." The screen went black. I sat there in the silence, my heart hammering against my ribs. She hadn't just been caught in a lie. She had proudly, angrily confessed to the truth, a truth far uglier than any lie she could have told. She had shown the world her soul, and it was rotten with entitlement. I looked at the frozen chat window. The first new comment finally appeared, and then another and another, until it was a flood. Did she really just say that the mask just came off? An investment in my talent equals I stole from my dead dad to go on vacation. She hadn't just lost the interview. She had lost the entire narrative. In under 60 seconds on a live broadcast to thousands of people, Olivia had done what I never could have. She had destroyed herself. The interview didn't just go viral. It became an obituary. By morning, the name Olivia Chandler was a synonym for entitled delusion in every online book club and local forum in New England. But the social media fallout was nothing compared to the financial one. The wolves who had been patiently circling began to close in. Our suppliers, who had been placated for months with promises and partial payments, saw the interview for what it was, a confession of fraud. The phone at the Chandler Pages started ringing at 9 a.m., and it didn't stop. It wasn't customers, it was creditors. Each call was the same. The friendly account managers were gone, replaced by grim-voiced collections agents. "The full balance is due immediately. We're terminating your line of credit. No further shipments will be made." My mother and Olivia locked themselves in their rooms, unable to face the consequences of the world they had created. So I was the one who answered the calls. I was the one who listened to the demands. And I was the one who finally called Arthur Vance and said the words I'd been dreading for 5 years. "It's over. We're insolvent." The bankruptcy proceedings were swift and brutal. An auction was scheduled. Everything had to be sold. The building, the fixtures, the remaining inventory. The Chandler Pages, as a physical entity, was going to be liquidated. 2 days before the auction, my mother and Olivia finally emerged from their self-imposed exile. They found me in the bookstore, placing stickers on old inventory, pricing my father's legacy for pennies on the dollar. "Claire, you can stop this," my mother said, her voice thin and reedy. I didn't look up from the stack of poetry books I was marking down. "No, I can't." "The collection," Olivia said, her voice lacking its usual arrogance. "The other books." Arthur said they're worth almost $100,000. That's enough to pay everyone off. We can save the house. I finally looked up. They were standing close together, a united front of desperation. They still didn't get it. They thought this was just another financial problem. I could solve another mess I could clean up. "The collection isn't for saving the house," I said, my voice quiet, but unyielding. "It's for saving the bookstore." "But this is the bookstore," my mother said, gesturing around the room, at the shelves, the building, the life they had taken for granted. I shook my head. "No, This is just a building. It's a cage I've been trapped in for 5 years. The bookstore, the real bookstore, is the name. It's the community. It's Dad's story. And that's the only thing I'm going to save. The day of the auction was cold and gray, a fitting backdrop for a funeral. A small crowd had gathered. Neighbors, other local business owners, a few bargain hunters. My mother and Olivia stood on the sidewalk across the street, watching their faces pale. They looked like ghosts haunting the scene of their own demise. I stood in the back of the crowd, a registered bidder with a number in my hand. Arthur stood beside me. "Are you sure about this?" he asked quietly. "There's still time. We could use the trust to pay off the debts and keep everything." "I'm sure," I said. This wasn't about revenge. It was about surgery. Cutting away the diseased parts to save what was still healthy. The auctioneer started with the fixtures. The antique cash register my father had loved sold for $200. The rolling library ladder's gone. Then came the inventory sold off in lots. With each rap of the gavel, I felt a piece of the past fall away. It hurt, but it was a clean, necessary pain. Then the auctioneer announced Lot 74. The business assets of the Chandler Pages, including all intellectual property trade name, customer lists, and remaining unsold inventory. He started the bidding. "I raised my number," another bidder countered. I raised mine again. It was over in less than a minute. "Sold," the auctioneer called out, to bidder 107. I walked forward and signed the paperwork, my hand steady. I now owned the soul of the Chandler Pages. The final item was the building itself. The house. The place I grew up. The place my mother and sister would now have to leave. The bidding started. I watched my face impassive, my bidding number held firmly at my side. The price climbed. A local real estate developer was bidding against a young couple. Finally, the gavel fell. "Sold," the auctioneer announced. I saw my mother flinch across the street, a small, sharp movement. Olivia put her head in her hands. I turned and walked away before they could see the tears in my own eyes. I didn't look back. There was nothing left for me there. The 30 days they were given to vacate the property passed in a blur of bitter arguments and half-packed boxes. I heard about it through Sarah, who reported that my mother had tried to sell some of my father's old furniture to her pieces that had been included in the sale of the house. Sarah politely declined. The new owners, a young couple with a baby on the way, moved in on a sunny Saturday, painting the front door a cheerful yellow that felt like a new beginning. My mother and Olivia moved into a small, rented apartment on the other side of town. It was in a complex with beige siding and identical balconies, a place of transient anonymity that was the polar opposite of the historic rooted home they had lost. Their social standing, which had been as solid and dependable as that old colonial house, evaporated almost overnight. Olivia, who had once spoken of her art as a calling, found that the art world was no longer calling back. The viral interview had branded her not as a misunderstood artist, but as a privileged fraud. The galleries that had once politely considered her work now sent curt one-sentence rejections. Her artist friends, the ones who had praised her avant-garde vision, stopped returning her calls. Her talent, whether real or imagined, had been propped up by a foundation of family money and a respected name. With both gone, she had nothing left to stand on. She tried to launch a new collection online, titling it Phoenix, a laughably transparent attempt to rebrand her public humiliation as a rebirth. It was met with a handful of pitying likes and a flood of comments referencing the literary lioness interview. She deleted her art page a week later. My mother, Susan, seemed to shrink. Her world, once defined by the solid walls of my father's house and the social standing it afforded, had contracted to a 2-bedroom apartment that smelled faintly of the laundromat downstairs. The friends she used to host for Bridge Club now had excuses when she called. Lunches were canceled. Invitations stopped arriving. She had built her identity around being the wife of a respected man and the mother of a brilliant artist. Without those roles to play, she seemed to have forgotten who she was. I heard from Arthur that she had tried to contest the business auction, claiming I had taken advantage of the situation. He had gently but firmly reminded her that I had legally purchased the assets in a public auction. She had every right to bid in herself. The argument went nowhere. She had spent a lifetime leaning on others first, my father, then me. Now all she had to lean on was Olivia, and they were like two drowning people clinging to each other, only pulling one another further under. Their days, from what I could gather, through the town's small but efficient grapevine, were spent in a state of mutual resentment. Olivia blamed my mother for not managing the family finances better. My mother blamed Olivia for her disastrous interview and her inability to turn her art into a viable career. They were trapped in a beige apartment with their shared failure and the ghost of a life they had squandered. There was no one left to bail them out, no one to clean up their messes, no responsible one to call when the bills came due. They had what they always wanted each other without me, in the way. They just never considered what that would actually look like. They were left with nothing but the consequences of their choices and the deafening silence of a phone that no longer rang with offers of help. The new Chandler Pages wasn't born from the ashes of the old one. It was planted in new soil. I found a small storefront on a sunny corner 2 blocks from the town square, a place with large windows that flooded the room with light. It was 1/4 of the size of the old store, but it felt 100 times bigger. It felt like mine. I used the money from my father's collection not to replicate his store, but to build something new. The shelves were a warm, light-colored pine. I created a children's corner with a soft, colorful rug and small chairs. I set up a coffee machine in the back that always smelled of fresh espresso and cinnamon. The bell above the door chimed a brighter, more hopeful note. It wasn't just a store anymore. It became a place where people gathered. We had story time for toddlers on Tuesday mornings, a poetry open mic night on Thursdays, a book club that met by the fireplace on the first Sunday of every month. I didn't just sell books. I curated experiences. I created a community around the stories we shared. The store thrived, not in a way that would make headlines, but in a quiet, steady, sustainable way. It was healthy. It was alive. And as the profits started to come in, I knew exactly what I had to do with them. I could have put it all away, built up my savings, created a fortress of financial security for myself. After years of scarcity, the temptation was there. But my victory over my family's selfishness couldn't end with an act of self-interest. It had to be something more. There are 2 kinds of justice in this world. There's the justice of punishment, the kind that looks backward. It's about settling scores about an eye for an eye. It's the satisfaction of watching those who hurt you finally fall. For a while, I thought that's what I wanted. I thought my peace would come from watching their world crumble. But there's another kind of justice, a quieter, more powerful kind. It's the justice of the sower. It doesn't focus on the scorched earth of the past. It focuses on planting seeds for the future. It's about building something beautiful where something ugly once stood. It's the ultimate act of defiance, not to destroy what your enemies value, but to create something they could never even imagine. My father's legacy wasn't just a collection of rare books. It was a love for the power of a story. So I took the profits from the new Chandler Pages and I established the Chandler Children's Fund. It was a small grant program providing free books to kids in low-income families and funding literacy workshops at the local elementary school. My ultimate victory wasn't watching my mother and sister lose their house. It was watching a 7-year-old girl whose parents could barely afford groceries walk out of my store, clutching her very first brand new hardcover book, her eyes wide with wonder. It was receiving a letter from a second-grade teacher telling me that a boy who had never shown an interest in reading was now devouring every book he could get his hands on, all because of the books our fund had provided. My mother and Olivia had taken a piece of my father's legacy and sold it for a fleeting moment of selfish pleasure. I took what was left and I planted it. I watched it grow into something that would nourish the community for years to come, long after Olivia's unsold paintings were forgotten in a dusty attic. That was my justice. Not the loud, satisfying crash of their downfall, but the quiet, persistent growth of something good. I hadn't just saved a bookstore. I had rewritten its story. The late afternoon sun spills across the polished pine floors of the new Chandler Pages. It warms the spines of the books lining the walls and illuminates the dust motes dancing in the air. On the colorful rug in the children's corner, a small circle of faces upturned and rapt. Watch me as I read the final page of a story about a brave little seed that learns to grow in a crowded garden. And so I read my voice soft, the little seed who had once been afraid of taking up space, finally bloomed, and its colors were brighter than anyone could have imagined. The end. A little girl with bright red pigtails claps her hands. "Read it again," she demands, and the other kids echo her. I laugh the sound, easy and genuine, and close the book gently. "Not today," I say, "but we'll have a new story next week." The sound of their parents arriving to pick them up fills the store a happy, chaotic symphony of thank yous. And see you next times. I watch them go, these little seeds, and my heart feels full in a way I never knew was possible. And as I stand here in the quiet aftermath, surrounded by the stories I chose and the life I built, I find myself thinking not of my own past, but of you. Yes, you. The one who's been listening to this story and feeling a familiar ache in your chest. The one who recognizes the silence, the dismissal, the quiet weight of being taken for granted. You are the Claire of your family. You're the one who remembers the birthdays, who pays the bills, who makes it work, who keeps the peace. You carry the invisible ledgers of emotional and financial debt that no one else sees. Your sacrifices are accepted, like taxes expected and unacknowledged. You've been told your practicality is a virtue, when really it's just been a convenience for others. You've been called the responsible one so many times you've forgotten you're allowed to be anything else. You've made yourself smaller, quieter, less demanding, hoping that one day your compliance will finally be mistaken for love. You have been living in a prison without bars, chained by a sense of duty that was handed to you, not chosen. I'm here to tell you something. I wish someone had told me 5 years ago when I was sitting in a dusty, dying bookstore, believing my worth was tied to the legacy I was killing myself to save. Your worth is not a debt to be paid back to the people you love. It is not measured by your usefulness. It is inherent. It is absolute. You do not need an invitation to celebrate your own life. You don't need permission to shine. Your story is not a footnote in someone else's. It is the main text. My story isn't about a bookstore. It's about a woman who finally realized she was allowed to write her own. And so is yours. So tonight, or tomorrow, or whenever you're ready, I want you to pick up the pen, start your own chapter, build your own library, plant your own garden, even if it's just a single pot on a windowsill. You are not on the fringes. You are the center of a story that is just waiting to be told, and it is going to be beautiful.